What's going on, everybody? Welcome again to another episode of Axioms on Trial. We're going to have a one-on-one discussion this time about Cease. You are in the hot seat tonight. How you feel, bud?
I'm good. It's good to see you. I'm glad that we're doing a show. Happy New Year, everyone. It's finally 2021. Hopefully it'll be a better year than the last one was. But yeah. I'm ready.
Yeah, I'm hoping we have a better year myself. I mean, I think everybody could use a break from the break, so to speak. But so today we're going to be talking about worldviews and what kind of is required in order to have an explanatory scope, explanatory power, however you kind of want to view that. Cease and our guest Luke kind of come in and kind of set what they mean by that and have the discussion go through that. I wanted to first say that we got the show that we had planned a while back. I don't know if anybody remembers. We had Matt Slick was supposed to come on. He ended up reaching out to me and saying he had gotten sick. His assistant actually just reached out to me to say that he could be booked at some point. So we're going to have him on here for discussion. So look out for that. The precept video will come out. I promise. Eventually, it will come out. I got the script pretty much done. We'll have me and Cease review it, and then we'll start narrating that. Other than that, we'll just go ahead and move on into the conversation. I'm going to bring in Luke. Luke's going to kind of just give us a little background on really anything I guess you'd want the audience to know, or that could be relevant to the conversation or anything like that.
Yeah. So my name's Luke. I think I'd say my first identifier and the thing most relevant to this conversation is I'm a Christian. And then beyond that, I'm studying mechanical engineering at Georgia Tech. And I'm sincerely excited to just have a good conversation. I'm probably going to learn a lot of things along the way. Yeah, I think this will be neat.
Awesome.
Yeah, thanks for coming on.
Glad to be here.
Yeah, I'm going to drop on out, have you guys go ahead and get started.
Cool.
Okay, so let's do it. So you had reached out saying that you wanted to sort of compare and contrast worldviews. And I guess, yeah, the floor is yours. And tell us what it is that specifically you believe, what you think a worldview is, and then I'll respond afterwards.
Yeah, sounds great. So for starters, I think it's good to just kind of get a working definition for worldview as we kind of get into this conversation. And the way I understand a worldview and what that means is that it's how we make sense of and kind of put together our experience of the world around us. So as we all have an experience of what it is to be human and what it is to live in this world we're in, we're learning a lot of things and we're kind of synthesizing that and interpreting it. And that interpretation and kind of systemizing and frameworking of everything is what I would call a worldview. And feel free to add or change to that. But I think that's kind of the starting point as we get into things.
No, I can't say that I disagree. That makes sense to me. I would only add that, there's probably beliefs that we have that are not necessarily based on primary experience, like theories that we might believe in because we trust the methods or whatnot. But overall, I'm in agreement with the definition. I think that's a good starting point.
Cool. Yeah, and so I think at the end of the day, where we're hoping to get to is sort of pit our worldview. I have a Christian worldview, and based on what I've seen from your channel, maybe I won't presume anything about your worldview. Maybe I should just start and hear yours instead.
Sure.
But I figure you have like a naturalist, atheist worldview. I don't want to put too many terms.
Yeah. So I'll break it down this way. I'm an atheist. I'm an agnostic atheist in the sense that I don't claim to have knowledge, ontologically speaking, of whether or not God exists or doesn't exist. My position is that I've seen no credible evidence or argument in support of God. Therefore, on an epistemic level, I don't believe because I see no reason to believe.
Right.
As far as my view on the nature of the universe, I'm open-minded. I mean, I don't claim any certainty in any sense. I think the most reasonable perspective is materialism and naturalism. It could be the case, perhaps, that the universe is dualistic or idealistic. I don't think that those views make as much sense or can be argued as well, especially not the dualistic approach. But I'm open-minded on all these levels. If the right argument and the right evidence presents itself, I'm not necessarily stuck on any particular perspective.
Yep. Cool. Yeah. And so I think ultimately what we're trying to get at is truth. And a lot of that is pitting worldviews against each other. But I feel like before we really get into that, it's better to start saying, all right, we have a worldview, which is a synthesizing and interpretation of the human experience. Let's start by asking the question, what are the most essential characteristics of the human experience? And then we can kind of discuss how our worldviews fit to that. So that was kind of my thought for this conversation.
Sure. That makes sense.
Yeah. And so I guess the first place to start is what are the core aspects, the core characteristics of the human experience? And of course, you can kind of start with the whole Descartes perspective. I think, therefore I am. And there are probably a bunch of those things that we both nod our heads to and say, yeah, I mean, that's how the human experience works. So the idea that we exist, we have some level of reasonably reliable perception of the world around us, I think are pretty integral, basic parts of the human experience. I think from there, what I find really fascinating is humans have this unique aspect. Humans are unique in the situation we find ourselves in. There's some sort of uniqueness about humanity. And we can get into what that means in a second. But that's kind of the next, as we're listing out kind of the most basic parts of the human experience, that to me seems like the next step.
Okay. I guess from my perspective, I would say the following. I think the foundation is the cogito. So like you said, I think, therefore I am, in a sense, in the phenomenological sense, where I can't think and not exist. It's incoherent. I would say that probably the next aspect that is sort of at the core of the human experience, but not just the human experience, but the experience period, is just my relation with the world and the other, what's viewed as in philosophy as the other. So you as a person, or whatever other mind I encounter, there is an immediate sort of question that presents itself of how do I relate to this other person, and what conflict does that relation possibly bring about, and how do we navigate the reality of the fact that now we're in this sort of relationship, phenomenologically speaking. So I'm not sure what it is you mean when you say that humans are in a unique position. I think we're unique in the sense that we have a capacity to self-reflect and question our situation that's on a higher level than other species. I don't think we're as far different. We're as different as I think some people want to claim we are. I think there's probably much more similarity than people recognize. But I'm curious to see what it is that you mean by that more specifically.
Yeah, so to break down what I mean by human uniqueness, I think there are a couple of different aspects of it. But I think one of the first things I would touch on is what you said, that we have this ability to self-reflect, and we have this ability to perceive the world around us at a much deeper, and understand the world around us at a much deeper level than anything else that exists. And sort of within that same vein, we have this ability to control the world around us, to form it in ways that are really unique to us as humans. So I think sort of that idea of understanding the world around us and controlling the world around us, that's one way in which humans are unique. And the other one, just for starters, I'm not putting together an exhaustive list here, is this ability to self-reflect and to look into, ask ourselves about the nature of ourselves and of the things around us. To me, seems very, very unique. I don't think there's anything else that does that.
I would say that there are, it's on a spectrum, right? Like there are certain species that can do it to a degree. There are certain species that can do, for example, that can solve puzzles better than humans can.
Like what? I'm just totally curious here.
So ravens and crows. I know that certainly some species of primates have shown an ability to sort of be able to be self-aware. And they've done experiments with this, whether it's mirrors. Some dogs seem to possess this. Now, they obviously, it on a much lower level. But you see there's sort of an evolution, an expansion of sort of conscious awareness depending on which species you're looking at. Now we are at the top of the pyramid there. And so I would agree, but I don't think there's anything problematic about that.
Yeah, well, see, and that's where you've just kind of placed it up on a spectrum, but I think there are a couple of things, maybe more that I could, if I thought more on this, I could list more, but at least like the first couple of things that come to my mind, I think there are a couple of things that are sort of categorically different more than they're simply an extension of the spectrum. For instance, the fact that we're able to make observations about other species, we're the only ones that do that. Or the fact that we're having a conversation about the nature of what is. I think that's something unique to humans. I don't think there's really an analog or sort of a spectrum that kind of descends backwards into if we were to look at it sort of from an evolutionary perspective.
No, so I would say differently. I would say that we've evolved from prior species to be able to do what we do now, but it didn't happen overnight. Like our ability to process information and to conceptualize to the degree we do is something that evolved over time, over billions of years, right? So so I agree that there's not a sort of an analogous example, especially not today comparing species today, but I think what evolution is sort of pointing to, and I'm not a biologist, but from my limited understanding, is that we've evolved from prior species of primates, and our ability to do what we do now is that sort of a result of a very long period of evolution and development.
Right. And so this is where I think we're already doing the second thing before we've kind of at least come to some sort of agreement on the first thing. And so the second thing being pitting worldviews against each other. From the way I see it, the idea of looking at it as in the context of evolution, and maybe I shouldn't have started by using that term, is already getting into the worldview thing. That we're looking at this idea of human uniqueness, and what it seems like you've just done is already start putting it into a framework instead of just putting it on the table as, is this a thing or not, as an aspect.
Oh, it's a thing. I agree, it's a thing for sure.
Okay.
It's definitely a thing. I think we just have different explanations to why it's a thing. But yeah, right. I agree with you. I agree with you for sure that it's something that we can point to.
Well, that's why I want to circle back a little bit, I feel like.
Sure.
And as we look, again, the idea of human uniqueness and the ability to ask ourselves about the nature of the world around us and the nature of ourselves, I'm suggesting is categorically unique. And I think you've just suggested is simply a continuation of a spectrum. And so I think that in starting with looking at the core human experience and characteristics, before we jump into explanations for those, which are the worldviews, which one is it of those? Does that make sense?
Sorry, ask that again?
Yeah. So as we're talking about, we're kind of honing in on a couple key points of what it is to be a human and what the human experience consists of. And so I've suggested there is something unique about humans in where we are in the world around us. That primarily has to do with our ability to grasp the nature of ourselves and the world around us and wrestle with it, interact with it in a way that nothing else does. And I think that is a categorical, unique, distinct thing that only humans have. And before we get into where that came from, the question is that or is that not a reality? Does that make sense?
I would say it's a reality that we can point to this uniqueness. Yes, I would agree with that.
Okay, so yeah, and I think that there were a couple aspects of that I wanted to get into, but one of those was our ability to wrestle with the nature of things. Another one is sort of having a distinctly higher and stronger grasp of the world around us and the ability to control it in a way that nothing else does. And that I can see how you could probably extrapolate that more as a spectrum and point to sort of analogs in the rest of the world around us. But at the end of the day, there is something unique about humans.
Can you elaborate on what you mean by our ability to control?
Yeah. So sorry, I'm probably getting a little bit ahead of myself. I spent a little bit of time thinking about this before we started talking, and so I'm probably jumping through a couple of mental hoops to get there. But anyways, as we talk about human uniqueness, I think as I thought about it, there are two non-exhaustive elements of that. One is the ability to ask ourselves questions and to wrestle with the nature of the world around us, which we've just discussed. The second one is we have a level of control of the world around us. If you look at the cities we can build, the things we're able to engineer, we have a level of control of understanding and describing the world around us in a language like math, and using that to produce and form the world around us as we would have it in a way that is different from everything else.
Right. So I guess I would say this. In the context of technology, obviously we're far more advanced than anything that has ever stepped on this planet. As far as our ability to really connect with, the reality of reality, I'm not quite as confident.
Okay.
Yes, I think language grasps something of what is out there. I think math also does. I think I'm not saying that there's no, obviously I trust in science, and I think science is really the one method that allows for this. I'm sure we'll disagree there. But I'm also not. Well, I think the one thing that I think something like physics teaches us is that actually many of our assumptions and intuitions about what is the case are turning out to be incorrect. And so what we think is the case, for the most part, is not how we experience it. Now, that doesn't mean that obviously language is still useful, all these things are still useful. And yes, we have a certain level of control over, we have an ability to sort of affect nature in a way that other things can't. Now, on the other hand, I also don't buy the idea that we're so evolved that we've somehow, and I'm not saying you're saying this, but sort of as a point of reference, we're not so evolved that we've overcome much of our biology. Many of our self-destructive instincts are still there. I personally, I don't see a good argument for free will in that sense. So we're still in a sense slaves to biology and physics and all these things. But if we're doing sort of a comparative approach between the way that we can control and affect nature to the rest of species, then I agree with you that there's definitely a giant leap there. But I would just sort of clarify to what degree I think that control is actually there. That makes sense.
Yeah, and that's a fair distinction. I think I don't remember who it was. Someone smarter than me who lived a long time ago said, "The more we know we don't know."
Sure.
Was that Socrates? Maybe I should know these things, but I don't. But yeah, that is I see what you're saying there. So sort of to loop back to kind of the framework of this conversation. First, we're talking about core characteristics of the human experience. And then from there, how do we make sense of them, and who does a better job of making sense of them? So far we've kind of laid out, we exist and we are thinking beings that have some level of perception of the world around us. That, to me, that's kind of like the ground we have to stand on to have a conversation. Sure. And then from there, we've said humans occupy a unique position. Is there more you would want to add to that in terms of just core? And this wouldn't be an exhaustive list. I don't think what I've created is an exhaustive list, but core elements of the human experience.
No, I would say we're in a unique position when looking at the situation under a certain type of light. Okay. There are certain things that I think other species probably do better than us. In this particular example, I think we're far beyond anything else. In some others, perhaps not quite on as much. But so again, it depends on sort of which side you're looking at. As far as other sort of groundings that we can talk about, I can't think off the top of my head of any other particular ones. I think I'm pretty much in agreement with you that at least what you've mentioned so far are sort of the grounding for this type of conversation.
Yeah. You said we're unique only in a certain light. Can you maybe unpack that a bit more?
Yeah, I mean, I've often, and this kind of not super well thought out because I'm kind of going off of sort of what I'm reacting to what you're saying. But there are many aspects in which I think human beings complicate their own existence and overthink certain things that probably exactly because of what you're describing, like animals don't have that capacity to sort of think on those levels. But sort of a result of that is also the fact that they're not experiencing certain levels of unnecessary suffering the way that we are in those contexts. I mean, one example that I gave earlier was like if you look at certain species of birds, they're extremely intelligent in the way that they approach certain puzzles, for example. I can send you some links later of videos where they make ravens, I think it is, do certain mazes, where they're having to move things around, using tools to then get the food.
Yeah, I saw a cool one where I think a raven used displacement to like float a nut higher up to get it out, and yeah, super fascinating. So I think I hear what you're saying. Anyway, sorry I interrupted.
No, you're fine. So there are certain under that light. It's like I don't think that I could do what a crow does in certain contexts. I mean, maybe I could figure out at some point. Certainly not with the speed that they can. I mean, they're doing these things in less than a minute. They're doing this incredibly fast. I spend, hours trying to get my laptop to work properly. Like, you know what I'm saying? Like, I think we're unique in certain ways, and they're unique in other ways, and I try to sort of stay away from any kind of speciesism of thinking that we're that special. Like, yes, we're special in certain regards for sure. What that means in sort of the larger scheme of things, I think is open to discussion.
And see, that's where I disagree with it. And I guess you can call me a speciesist then. But I think we are special in a unique way, different than say a crow is from a pig or something like that. Like there's something of the rest of living things that is very different from humanity. And so like the examples you've cited have to do with problem solving and achieving so like pretty base things, getting to food and things like that. But there's nothing else that is looking for truth and asking about the nature of the world around it or making observations on other species. So call me a speciesist, I guess, but I think we are.
So I agree with the first part. It depends on what you mean by observations, because animals make observations of their environment and the species they're encountering all the time. Now, if you mean more on an existential level,
can I clarify that a bit?
Yeah.
So I guess I was even just referring to what you've just said. You've made an argument by appealing to a whole other species, but that's all to make an argument based on a systematic understanding of the world around you in a way that I just don't think anything else does.
Right. No, I mean, I can probably agree that in the context of self-reflection, or the degree of self-reflection we have, and sort of the philosophical aspect of what it is that humans do. Yeah, I would agree entirely that we don't find another species that does the same.
Yeah, so I'd say we're categorically unique in a way that, say, like in a different way than a pig is different from a bird. Like humans are categorically unique in a very distinct way from the rest of everything within.
Yeah, I guess I'm not sure we determine categorically. Like I'm not sure.
I guess I'll explain what I mean by that really quick, because there are probably a lot of implications to that word that I don't know because I'm just less philosophically educated. I guess really all I mean by saying categorically is not on a spectrum, that there's just a clear distinction, if that makes sense.
Right. So I think that's probably where I don't agree.
Okay.
Like I was saying earlier, I don't think that we came into being the way that we are, just different in that way. So I think the spectrum is present in the way in which we have evolved to have this difference.
And that's where we're getting more into the explanation of what we see.
Sure.
Yeah, and this might be a hard thing because we both just operate on very different frameworks. Right. But to me, it seems so clear, just in the dialogue, in the fact that we're having this conversation, that there's something in a non-spectrum way unique about humans.
Right. Yeah, I don't agree with that conclusion. I agree with the observation that there is a uniqueness. I disagree with sort of the framework in which you're expressing that.
Right. And this gets hard because we both know like the implications everyone's trying to get to with this.
Sure.
But I think I've kind of cited the example of ascertaining truth and looking and having dialogue to discern the nature of ourselves and the world around us as a function that humans have that nothing else does, which to me is an example of a categorical. And again, all I mean by that is non-spectrum distinction. So I'm curious to hear, I guess, a case made for why humans exist only on a spectrum distinction.
Because for our current understanding, that's what biology tells us. That's what here's a good comment. And I was going to say this actually. There are species that display an appreciation for fairness, an ability to detect emotions, and many other things that put them on a spectrum. So yes, you're not going to get a dog, sitting on a couch, figuring out the cogito, right? Like that's not what I mean. But much of what we think of ourselves as human beings have sort of connections with other conscious beings. Now, yes, I think we're unique in the way in which we approach questions of truth, to the degree to which we can think about these things. I would never claim otherwise. I think that would be silly. But to me, that's biology explains this. I guess where I'm trying to figure out is the conclusion. And again, I don't want to put words in your mouth or jump too far, but maybe we might as well. I don't know how you want to approach it, but I'm trying to figure out, is the claim that you're trying to make is that in this uniqueness somehow constitutes evidence that we have a certain kind of purpose that's different than everything else, and that you're using God as sort of this foundation for the explanation of this purpose?
Yeah, and that's sort of where I was getting to, so you got me. But yeah, and so what I'd say, first of all, I think it's cool to see where we've come so far in this conversation, that we acknowledge some kind of uniqueness. And I guess from here, it's a question of the nature of that uniqueness, whether it is categorical, and again, I simply mean non-spectrum, versus spectrum. And yeah, from there, another thing I'd be curious to discuss, although I think there's probably more we could already say on this, is the idea of meaning. And this, I honestly think I'm just going to benefit from this conversation because I still am very bad at not using very fuzzy, non-clear terms to talk about this. And so I don't know if we want to keep talking about whether this uniqueness in humans is spectrum versus non-spectrum, or whether we're just going to start kind of butting heads without getting anywhere. So we could either keep going in that vein, or discuss whether there is any kind of actual meaning, or at the very least, to me, what seems very apparent as a human is that I at least have a perception of meaning.
Sure.
And so we could either like take that next step and just kind of table what we've talked about with uniqueness so far, or keep going there. I'm good either way.
Well, I'll address both positions, and then I want to hear what your perspective is. On the sort of the uniqueness aspect of it. If you're going to say that this uniqueness is self-evidently particular to humans,
Mm-hmm.
What I would want to know is, on what ground do you make that assumption? Or if it's not an assumption, on what ground do you make that claim? Because from my perspective, and this is to some extent, we have to get into the sort of the methodologies here.
Mm-hmm.
I think of some things like the scientific method is, I think, the most rigorous approach. All its flaws that you might want to point to get us to the closest understanding of reality as we can have it. And there's nothing currently about scientific discovery that we've made since we've been in this game that suggests, on the level of physics, on the level of biology, on the level of chemistry, that God is a necessary assumption to make in order for all these things to work. So yes, we can agree about the uniqueness, but how do we explain that uniqueness? Well, biology has a framework that has a certain level of explanatory power, has a certain level of predictive power, where it can sort of bridge, the gaps in our knowledge and create a certain type of picture. I'm yet to see anything remotely like that on the side of the theism perspective, other than, well, there's something that we can't explain yet, perhaps, therefore God did it, or therefore, that to me is not enough to give credence to the God hypothesis. In the context of meaning, I know many atheists that will say things like meaning doesn't exist, it's not real, and I completely disagree with that. And I actually don't even think that it's that difficult of a concept, that difficult to prove that it's clearly a thing. All that I mean by meaning is sort of the state of fulfillment that is possible, simply being the simple fact that we are organisms with consciousness, with the capacity to experience. And it is through those experiences that we derive meaning. And all I mean by meaning is, what sort of things do I engage in that, and I don't mean just on a level of basic pleasure, I mean on something deeper than that. I mean a sort of a fulfillment, whether it comes through music or relationships or whatever sort of, I mean, the particular road to that state of being can be subjective, it can be different from person to person. But the end result of the sort of the phenomenological experience of fulfillment is going to be more or less the same. And that's what I think people mean when they use the word meaning. So while, yes, there's not a cosmic meaning in the sense that the universe hasn't designed with any kind of intent for us to have a particular destiny or a particular, so I don't see meaning in that sense as God-given. I see it simply as an observation of what it is to be a conscious being, which again can be explained without having to resort to metaphysical assumptions that I think don't have a grounding. That's how I would reply to that.
Gotcha. Yeah, that was a lot, which
Sorry,
I appreciate. Yeah, that's great. That's great. And it's cool to hear you kind of very clearly and in a very organized fashion kind of lay out your understanding of things. And there's like something from back at the beginning that I want to probably talk about. And so, and if I am beating a dead horse or we're continuing to butt heads, feel free to say that's what we're doing and we can move on. But as we go back to uniqueness, I think I'm kind of jotting notes to try and remember all the points you're making. And so you asked, and maybe I shouldn't put words in your mouth, but I'll paraphrase and you can tell me if I'm paraphrasing well enough, of what kind of grounds we have to make a claim that we are unique. I kind of jotted that down. I don't remember if that's exactly what you were getting at. This is very early on. In fact, honestly, I haven't written it down well enough to to reflect it correctly. So maybe I should just move on. But I guess my last point I would make to the uniqueness thing is the fact that we are making truth claims, to me, is already, just as we're coming back to the very beginning of what it means to be a human and what it means to have a human experience. The fact that we're asking those questions and doing things like making claims and pursuing truth says we occupy a unique position in the world we live in.
We do, but
Mhm.
but the thing is, from that observation of uniqueness, what can be derived from that observation?
Right. And that's where, yeah, sweet. And so I think that's what we're getting at next, which is starting to really put our worldviews at work there to say, all right, like given this, which one is the more satisfactory explanation of that perspective? Before we really get into that too much, if it's cool, you talked a lot, a good bit about the scientific method as the most effective, if I remember correctly, the most effective means of understanding truth. Or I'm probably horribly phrasing that. I don't know if you want to repeat what you said.
I want to just show this comment.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't. I both agree and disagree there.
And see, I think that's an interesting. So we fit anatomically, embryonically. Oh, it just went away.
Sorry.
And genetically within the tree of life. From those perspectives, therefore, uniqueness does not apply. The onus is on Luke to identify uniqueness. And see, I'd actually disagree, because to get to that point of making the statement with evidence that we fit within, from a genetic perspective and so on, the tree of life, which I think is a cool metaphor. You have to start from the place of doing the things that make us unique, of understanding the world around us, asking truth-based questions, and processing and evaluating and weighing claims. Like, to me, that comes first as in the human experience before we can even start piecing together all the evidence out there, that we do this thing of piecing together truth in a way that nothing else does. And so to me, that's more self-evident than from there looking out at the evidence around us after already acknowledging we have this unique ability to discern truth.
So, well, I guess I'll just say this, and I think when I had my brother on last time, I think he made this point where, I don't think we arrive at truth from sitting and just thinking about it.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I think there is a value to going out there and sort of figuring out how the puzzle pieces fit together. Mm-hmm. I think it's pretty clear, sort of on a scientific sense of things, that we fit within that tree the way that he described it. That's not to say that within that framework you don't find a spectrum of uniqueness in certain regards. I think, like we were saying earlier, I think an argument can be made there. I don't have a problem with the premise of uniqueness. What I would, like I was saying earlier, what I would just push back on is just this idea that what that suggests, and to you it seems to suggest something that, to me, it doesn't even begin to suggest. And that's where I think probably it's a good time to get into our worldviews.
Yeah.
In our particular frameworks.
Mm-hmm. And so that was, yeah, I'd agree. I think we could probably start to get there now. Acknowledging we probably have a different perception a little bit of
course
what really is core to the human experience. Before we do that, could I just ask what you mean by the scientific method, like how you would define that and what that is?
Yes, I think it is, how would I say this? The most rigorous approach that tries to make the least amount of assumptions when it functions the way it's supposed to. So whether, obviously it's empirical in nature, it has to have predictive power. It has to be able to make predictions. These basically, it's the creation of models that take in what is a theory? It's a model that takes in facts that have been observed about existence and tries to make sense of them. And so it has to have explanatory power and it has to have predictive power. I'm sure there's a better way of framing that. I'm not a scientist, and I'm always a little bit uncomfortable when sort of taking that approach to it. But I think the two core issues really is that predictive power and explanatory power, and really sort of grappling with our one-to-one experience of the world, rather than sort of often the speculative metaphysics that other approaches try to do. Which I think the problem that approach runs, those other attempts to explain reality run into, is that we can never discern whether those perspectives are imaginary or actually capturing something real. There is some problem with that even with the scientific method to a certain degree, because most of what what we experience is processed through our faculties, and those are problematic. But science, at least as far as I understand it, has functioned to sort of get underneath many of our assumptions and actually show those assumptions to be incorrect. As opposed to other worldviews, which seem to sort of, this seems to make sense, and therefore let's build sort of a story off of these assumptions that we are comfortable with. I guess that's what I would say.
Okay. Yeah. Can I kind of push on that a little bit? I just want to make sure I have a really kind of clearly defined picture of what you mean by the scientific method, because I think that's what we're going to start talking about a good bit next. Sure. Sort of, because I think that is in a sense a worldview. And actually, I think that's what I heard from you as you described the scientific method was sort of a very, a lot of different kind of parts without like a single definition. And so I saw you talk about approaching things with the least number of assumptions, empirically observing the world around us, and using that to kind of guide our understanding of the world around us. Creation of models.
Let me give you a more because I just looked up the specific definition, right, which I agree with. It's a method of procedure that has characterized natural science since the 17th century, consisting in systematic observation, measurement, and experiment, and the formulation of testing and modification of the hypotheses. This includes, like I was saying earlier, the value of explanatory and predictive power. Maybe that's a better way of framing it, more clear way of framing it.
Okay. So if I could try and put that in my own words, what you mean by the scientific method is acquiring knowledge by systematically observing the world around us and weighing the value of a proposition based on explanatory power and ability to predict things. That's what you mean by the scientific method?
Yeah, and the framework for which allows us to test our hypotheses, make experiments, and also sort of the falsifiability of hypotheses. Like, it's a good thing that any hypothesis in science that we can come up with, well, we could falsify them. And that's the point of the experiments, is to show does this idea actually hold up to the data that then we can gather from doing experiments and engaging with the world.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And I heard you make the statement, it is the best way of acquiring knowledge. I think that might have been what you used. I can't remember.
Yeah, I have some problem with the term knowledge.
Okay.
I think probably.
I guess I should have checked that from your screen name.
Yeah, it really is a matter of semantics. I mean, there are many people in philosophy that just think of knowledge as justified true belief. I don't know if I think knowledge is not really. I'm more comfortable, and might be just a preference, to just say what what justified beliefs do we have? I don't call it knowledge, right? Because when I think of knowledge, I think of certainty. Instead I think I call it a justified belief given the tools that we have, and given the condition that we're in. And I think science is the method, or sort of the framework which does that far better than anything else. I don't think any other approaches even come close to doing what science does.
Okay. I have like one or two more questions, then I think we can both just kind of throw our worldviews out there and get to it. As you say, science is the best way. Do you think there are exclusive, like, do you think there can't be simultaneous systems going on for a person for understanding the world around us, or arriving at those justified beliefs? So in other words, if you're operating on the scientific method, can you also simultaneously be operating on some other system, or is it exclusive? Does that make sense as a question?
I'm not sure, because I think people think about reality differently all the time. Like, you can be a scientist who applies the scientific method, and then in the context of religious belief, completely abandon the same sort of rigor that you would upload, but if you're asking if I think other approaches we can derive knowledge or good reasons to believe in a proposition through other means, other than maybe the exception of certain types of logic, and even that, because I think of logic and language as this descriptive, I also kind of think that it's the result of our experience of the world. I don't think that things like, for example, personal anecdotes or personal testimony, or certain kind of, even if how would I say this, transformative experiences, like in the context of Christianity, for example, I don't deny that there are people who found Jesus and are far happier now, or have felt like their lives have been transformed. That to me is more that's more illuminating of psychology than external truths or facts about reality. I've read philosophy books that have completely transformed my view and my experience of life, and there was nothing supernatural about it. So yeah, I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, it kind of does. I guess what I'm getting at, the way I see it, science has a scope, just like everything has a scope. So science is really good for describing and finding justified beliefs for certain things, but isn't what I would use to come to a conclusion or come to a justified belief in other areas of life. And maybe that's because I'm just using the wrong definition of science. But
so what would you use? Well, what I guess specifically, what are you referring to?
Yeah, so this is kind of a dumb example, but just to kind of sort of just point out what I mean by scope. If I wanted to know someone's favorite food, I would ask them. And I don't think that's a scientific method. There's a different way of coming to a piece of knowledge or a piece of justified belief. That is a different kind of justified belief. It is just in a different category of things to know or things to understand. And so there's a different kind of line of reasoning for that. That's kind of a off the top of the head example. I don't know how far or not far to take that one, but all that to say, I think there's a scope of things science answers, but different questions have different means of thinking through them.
So I would agree that there's a scope. I don't agree that I think anything science can't answer, I think other methods can't either. Okay. And I think other methods approaches to answering those things are actually worse, far worse. Your example about ice cream, I think still seems to me to be of a certain empirical nature. I'm not sure that would be that outside of the realm of sort of gathering information the way that a scientist would necessarily.
Okay.
But yeah, it just, yeah.
Okay. Yeah. And I think I'm probably going to, as we continue to go into this conversation, I'll probably have some catching points, and that's I would figure, stem from different understandings of what we mean by the term science or scientific method.
Sure.
So I think if we get a point where we're butting heads or missing each other, that might be a good thing to kind of circle back to and see what we mean. But yeah, I guess I can go ahead and lay out my perspective and worldview, and we can start kind of hashing into it. But as a Christian, I think the world and the entirety of the universe was created by God. Within that, I think humans were created distinct in His image, with the ability and the role to control and cultivate the world in which we live. In our present state, humanity is in a condition of rebellion against God. And God has, in the person of Jesus, begun reconciling humanity's rebellion to Him. And so, kind of looping back to what we've been talking about so far, with the idea of how that fits as a worldview that explains the human experience, that covers, of course, existence and being a thinking person that perceives the world around us. But that's where we really get into uniqueness and the ability to make claims and the ability to understand and interact with the world around us and control the world around us in a distinct way. To me, makes more sense if we do in fact occupy a unique position established by God. To me, that makes more sense than to say that uniqueness that we have is actually illusory, is an illusion. And of course, I think that's where we already butted heads a little bit in terms of the nature of our uniqueness. And that'll continue to probably be difficult here. But that's my, at a very kind of boiled down level, I'd say that's my worldview and how it explains the human experience of our uniqueness.
Right. So I guess what I would say is, why do you think that makes more sense? Like, how this is the problem for me, which is, we can agree with the uniqueness, but and we can probably look
I think
at
we
the world.
don't totally agree with the uniqueness. And sorry, I interrupted you.
So we agree that it's a thing, but we disagree on what explains it. And from my perspective, I don't mean this to sound rude. I don't know how to say it without it coming off a little bit. I don't know, but what I hear are claims. What I don't hear are justifications. The entire framework of Christianity, for me, from my perspective, makes very little sense. If God wanted, for example, I don't see the need for a God that wants sort of the relationship with His creation to be redeemed. Why would it be necessary to send Himself or a version of Himself on a suicide mission of sorts? To do what? It also depends on how you interpret it. I mean, some people interpret it as, God was trying to show how He loved us by sharing our suffering. Other people think that literally Jesus' death erased our sins, which to me is immoral because I see it as a scapegoating. But all these things, ultimately, the question that matters to me is, what justification do you have to say that this is reality? Mm-hmm. And my justification is, we have a method that doesn't start off with assumptions. We have a method that dives into our condition and tries to make the best sense of it by gathering data, by experiments, by being able to make predictions, by creating models that ground the hypothesis into something more constructive. if you want to say that God explains the uniqueness, I would just say, well, why and how? Because it just seems to me like, yes, I mean, we can have premises, but how do you justify those premises? That's where I think the problem lies for me.
Right. And so all the things you've listed, I think each of them could have their own conversation, and throughout history have had conversations that go like above and beyond my pay grade. And so as we lay out all of that and all the different questions of how does that all work, I'm not gonna try and answer all of those because I don't have the knowledge to answer all of those. I think that's where I want to try and keep it boiled down to what we've talked about so far in terms of the human experience and which worldview gives a more satisfactory answer to that. And so from my perspective, humans have this unique position, and that seems very, very self-evident. We're distinct. And the scientific method and a naturalist perspective doesn't provide the grounds to fully explain why we have this unique position that we're in. And that kind of, anyways, I'll leave it at that first.
Well, the thing is, like, I don't understand where that opinion comes from, because I think not only does it do exactly that, but it does it to a much more extensive, particular degree, with far more explanatory power. Let's compare sort of the history here of our approaches, right? God and gods, from my perspective, were an invention to try to explain the mystery of life. So you don't know how fire takes place, or you don't know what a storm is. You're going to project certain, humanistic features like anger, and believe that God is angry with humanity, and that's why there's a storm. So, what is a storm? Well, God is causing it. Until you get people who are not satisfied with that assumption, who look at reality on a deeper level, and actually understand that no, storms are something, this much more complex, and these are, the ways in which, why it is that storms appear, and it's broken down in real concrete ways that actually are explaining the phenomenon, not just putting on, God. Well, what is God? Well, we don't really know. We can't really fully access what God is, other than some vague thing, but God is, is doing all this thing. To me, that's not an explanation. It doesn't have any explanatory power. It's just something people are just saying. When I look at, we're talking about uniqueness, from my perspective, that's entirely explained by biology and chemistry, and our role in sort of in the world. There is nothing left over from understanding evolution that leaves our ability to self-reflect sort of this huge mystery. I mean, yes, consciousness to some degree is still an open question. We haven't fully understood where that comes from. But that to me is like, the God of the gaps. It's like every time that we thought God was an answer, and then we looked deeper, we found something that explained things better, or explained things in actual detail. To me, just to say God did it doesn't really explain anything. And if you want to say that God created us with this uniqueness in mind, my question is, how do you arrive at that conclusion and know that your belief is not imaginary as opposed to reflective of what's actual? Because I can say, well, I can explain uniqueness by looking at evolution, looking at the way which brains developed to be able to perceive and conceive of things that are on a more complex level than other species. Like, these are all things that we can particularly look at in detail through science. And you're saying that, no, this doesn't really explain it as much as, I have this book that says God did it. Like, You get what I'm saying?
I think so. And so I feel like the first thing I'd say is I don't look at God that way to begin with, as an explanation for the unknown. And so to start in that capacity, that God is simply an explanation for the unknown, well, now we know the unknown, so it wasn't God. To me, doesn't seem like a great definition for God.
Well, just to clarify, I'm not saying that therefore that disproves God. I'm not saying that. I'm saying
that's kind of the agnostic thing, right?
It's an extra assumption that is unnecessary.
Right. And so that's where, I see what you're saying. I'm going like 2 or 3 different directions at once. So I'm trying to figure out where I want to go. Let's see. Sorry, just going back through my outline really quick of what you've been saying. Yeah, I think that's where it circles back to seeing God. Is our God-given uniqueness not at odds with our God-given constrained biological context? I honestly don't understand that as a question. If we want to talk about that, we can. Otherwise, I think I know where I wanted to go now.
No, go ahead.
Okay. So that's where I think it goes a step back into a worldview where, how do I put this? Where I think there are more questions that need to be answered other than simply how the world works. Because as I see it, that's what science does, is it describes a lot of how without really describing much of the why. That science, as you like the examples you cited of, say, thunderstorms, or I guess that's the only one I remember, but weather patterns. All science does is describe the interaction of a bunch of variables and how they correlate or don't correlate. But what it hasn't done and doesn't do is describe why. And so as we look at the idea of human uniqueness, science can do a great job of explaining sort of how we got to the point of humans occupying a unique position. But at the end of the day, it doesn't explain why we find ourselves sitting here as the only beings able to wrestle with questions of truth. And I think that's where assumptions are still happening. And the assumption is there's no answer to that question of why. But that's still an assumption. Does that make sense at all? I'm not sure if I'm making sense to myself.
No, I get what you're saying, but I think there's some problems here. One, because to me, the why becomes the how. The two questions are actually not as distinct. Unless you mean, well, why is it that the laws of physics are what they are in the first place? Like, why is it that things are what they are as opposed to something else? Even if science could answer that, I think you could always sort of extend it, well, why that, as opposed to... but I think that's the wrong question to ask. I don't think... I think this is what Wittgenstein talks about when he's referring to sort of questions that actually lack real meaning or content. You're assuming that there is a why. You're assuming an intention. And that is an assumption that I don't make. And even if there was some sort of actual why, whether it's a naturalistic explanation or a supernatural explanation, it seems to me sort of almost naive to think that we could find that answer. And so I'm okay if the question even makes sense, which I'm very skeptical that it does. I'm okay with saying I don't know. Like I think, given our circumstances, given the evidence that actually exists in the world, from which we should build a worldview that is coherent with the information that is present. The why is not accessible to us, and I think anybody that says that they have a worldview that has answered it really is running into the problem of, you were not, again, I don't put words in your mouth or say this is just my perspective of religious people in general, and not just religious people, but most ideologies. I'll even extend it to. Most people believe what they believe not because they have good reasons, but because they want something to be true.
Mm-hmm.
And so they construct they're trying to construct a narrative, and they take in information to try to fit, to sort of push the data or reinterpret the data in a way that will fit what it is that they need and want to be true. And I think that's primarily what science doesn't do. Science is trying to disprove itself all the time. How would we ever know that the why you've arrived at is actually real and not imaginary? Let's say that you want to say that the reason, the why for the uniqueness is because God made us in His image, and He made us with a purpose, and that's why we're what we are. How do you know that is not just a fantasy? Like, how do you know that's actually reality? I'm not saying that I know it to be false. I'm saying that there's no methodology that you can point to that can bridge that gap, that can get us to the potential and imaginary to the actual and real. That's why I said earlier that whatever, I can agree with you that there are certain questions science can't answer, potentially. But if that's the case, no other methodology can answer those questions either, because all they're doing is making assumptions and creative narrative. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, a lot of that made sense. And I think this has often been the trend. I probably have a couple different places to go. For starters, I think one thing you called me out on is assuming that there is a why, assuming that there is that the question of why we exist in this unique position is a question that actually needs to be answered. And I think I'll first raise the question of which one needs the burden of proof, of whether that question exists or does not, because it seems like that's been an inherent question to humanity pretty much throughout history, of asking the question of why we exist, why we are put in this unique position of grasping the world around us in ways that nothing else does, wrestling with questions of truth in ways that nothing else does. To me, the fact that question has existed for so long means that's the starting place, and to assume the contrary of that is the one that needs the burden of proof. So that's kind of one point. I'll start with that. I think you said something else I wanted to get back to, but I'll start with that.
Yeah. So I don't agree with that for the sole reason that, one, I can just remain agnostic as to whether or not the question actually has an answer. But the fact that people have asked that question holds no, that doesn't add any kind of value to the truth claim that it has an answer. The reason for the question could be explained, again, not saying this is true, but it could very easily be explained through psychology. Like, we are creatures that seek patterns. We're creatures that seek meaning, and therefore, we try to come up with stories, but that nowhere does that give a validity to the actual question. It just shows that we're a certain type of organism that does a certain type of thing. the burden of proof is on the person making the positive claim, right? I don't think there is a why, but I don't know, because I don't believe I have access to ontology on that level. I would say that if it seems unlikely that there is a sort of given purpose, I don't know that there is. I'm open-minded to the possibility that there could be. I just see no approach which can provide us with an answer that we could then know was an actual answer as opposed to a story. And there's many things that are true about us that have always been the case that we know are, terrible things to point to. Like, we know that our experience, the way that we look at space and time, the way that we or the way that we experience colors, or all the self-destructive aspects of our nature that has always existed. Well, the first things I mentioned, we know through physics that they're actually inaccurate. We don't perceive reality as it is. We perceive it as something very different. And science is actually helping get underneath those assumptions. Yet we've operated on a sort of a common sense view of the world for the majority of humanity, and it's only now that we're discovering that actually there's something more fundamental there, and our assumptions are actually not really matching with reality. And this value of science is that it's uncovered this. So. I don't think the burden of proof is on me to say that the question of why doesn't make sense. I can just say I can understand the question, and given what I understand about humanity, but whether or not it has an answer, we have no access to that.
Mm-hmm. Right. And so I guess what I'd say is, as we're looking, because I think the question we're kind of getting down to is sort of a theism question: is God there? Is God not there? And I think we approach that asking what makes the most sense. That's how I tend to approach it. What makes the most sense? And so that's not any idea of certain knowledge, and that's not something that's entirely deductively reached. But to me, that's what makes the most sense of our own uniqueness. Whereas it seems like the scientific end of things, and I don't want to pit those against each other, honestly. Like one thing you brought up earlier, this was another thing I wanted to circle back to, was sort of pitting different religious ideologies against each other and saying, well, how do we know which one was the right one if we got to that point? And I'd say, like, I'd go about things in a very scientific manner from there, of weighing evidence and seeing what's falsifiable. So I kind of don't like that we're pitting science against religion, because I don't think it works exactly in that way. But I think as we approach the question of God, the first thing that I would want to ask is what makes the most sense. And that's where, as I look at the uniqueness we have as beings that occupy a distinct role in the world we live in, having an explanation or a purpose for that makes more sense than to say that's simply an illusion.
But I would ask why you think that. I would ask why it is that you. I understand you're wanting to not put science and religion against each other. Mm-hmm. I happen to think that their methodologies are entirely in conflict. Mm-hmm. Not that science can disprove God, but the methodology that people use to arrive at religious belief, I think, is fundamentally different than what science is doing. Mm-hmm. Everything science finds out could be true and God still be in the picture, or some form of God, maybe not particularly the organized religions versions, depending on that interpretation. But when you say it makes the most sense, I don't understand what you mean by that, or where you arrive at making that claim. It makes no sense based on what? I don't. because again, you're taking this observation of uniqueness and constructing a story, saying it makes the most sense, but yet the problem is that you lack the methodology to show that what sounds good to you has any grounding in reality. You just kind of put these concepts together. It sounds good, but that's not the same thing as sort of rationality. Like it seems like it makes maybe intuitive sense to you, but I wouldn't see that as a justification, because many of our intuitions are, in fact, wrong about existence. So yeah, I just don't really get that.
Right, and that's where there are a lot of different avenues of thought, and so I've done a number of different sort of forays into apologetics and looked into things in that area, and there are a lot of different arguments and evidences to point to that work together to kind of build my worldview. And I think what I was hoping to do in this conversation is really hone in on a single issue. So in this case,
Sure.
Human uniqueness, and ask the question, whose worldview really applies better to that? And so I could start listing off other evidences I see so more externally to explain why I'm convinced of what I'm convinced of.
I mean, it's up to you. It's up to you. If you want to remain with the question of uniqueness, that's fine. But I guess where I'm left sort of confused by is, why it's almost like, from my perspective, on one hand, there is a whole set of data that breaks down the spectrum I've mentioned, breaks down how do I say this?
Sorry, could you explain the spectrum you've mentioned? What exactly do you mean by that phrase? I just want to make sure I'm tracking.
In terms of biology, the development of consciousness among species over time that has allowed for us to be able to think in a way that is unique. Like, from my perspective, we have naturalistic explanations for these things that you are arbitrarily saying don't work, and then saying this assumption of God makes more sense. And I don't understand that, because why does it make more sense then? And here's what we know about evolution. This is how we've evolved. This is how the mechanism works. This is sort of the turning point of how brains got bigger, and therefore the capacity of thought. I know it's not just because it's bigger you're more rational. And like I said, the example of crows, but you get what I'm saying. Like we have explanations for these things that I don't understand on what ground you're claiming are less reasonable than your worldview.
Okay, yeah, I think this is what I've been trying to get at, and have not been doing a very good job of getting at, is I don't think anything you've laid out so far of evolution as an explanation disagrees with anything I've said, because I think there are a lot of different elements in terms of making sense of things and asking questions of how and why. And so a method of evolution and of laying that out, which I don't think is entirely exclusive from the question of whether God exists or does not exist. So in other words, to say we are where we are right now from an evolutionary process in terms of our cognition and our ability to see the world around us, to say that isn't to say anything about whether or not God is there.
No, it's not, right?
Yeah,
but it is to point to. It does point to the God hypothesis to be unnecessary. Like, you're not explaining more things by sort of talking about God being behind it all. Like, if you want to say, oh, evolution is real, and maybe, again, you said the evolution doesn't really counter what you said earlier, but to some degree it does, if you want to claim that the spectrum isn't a thing, because evolution is showing that it is. So on some extent, we disagree on what the facts are here.
Yeah.
But if you want to say, well, okay, no, evolution is all well and good, but God set it in motion, you can always sort of attach God to any kind of discovery of the mechanics of reality. And that's fine. Like, I don't think evolution disproves God, unless people think Adam and Eve were actually people, like that type of, I mean, that's clearly been falsified. But again, that's not really the issue. The issue is God as an explanation is unnecessary. You don't need to even pose that, because the question of uniqueness can be resolved simply by looking at the process. And there doesn't have to be the process doesn't even have to be self-aware. It can just be, this is the mechanics of reality. This is what it has led to. And that's what we have access to talk about. Now, maybe there is some other, some aspects of ontology, and maybe God is a part of that, or maybe something else is a part of that, and we don't have access to that. But all I'm saying is that let's talk about what we have access to, and what seems to explain, what we're able to engage with. And there's nothing about the naturalistic perspective on the question of uniqueness that is problematic or that falls short. And it seems to me that the fact that it makes more sense to you that the question of uniqueness is answered by God seems to be, to me, more to be wishful thinking than what's actually than good reason grounded in our experience.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So maybe to unpack what you're saying a little bit, I'm also starting to get tired as we've been talking for so long. Okay. But evolution explains all the way up to that we are in the situation we're in right now of consciousness and so forth. But then I think what your worldview does from there is, as we find ourselves in this situation of looking at the world around us and being able to ask truth questions and questions about the nature of where we are, and asking why have we found ourselves here, of being in this situation of observing the world around us, observing our own nature, and being able to step back and ask what the point of it all is. From your perspective, there is no answer to that. There is
no. There is. Those questions arise from the fact that we are organisms in the world with the capacity to think on a deeper level, and so the answer is we're the kind of creatures that do that. It is in our nature to ask these questions. Whether or not all these questions have answers or not is it might be more of an issue of psychology than what is actually real out there. But I don't think there's anything strange that naturalism isn't answering about how it is that we're in the situation that we're in. We can experience, we can think, we have memory, we can think about stuff on a deeper level. Every one of those aspects, naturalism can answer, and can do so within a framework that's falsifiable, that can provide detailed explanations, that can make predictions. All the things that I see lacking from the religious perspective. I'm open-minded. Like, if somebody could bring to me sort of a framework of evidence that would show me why it is that God is actually a good explanation, that actually answers things in detail, that can make sense of these things, if there's something left over from naturalism, that would be great. But I haven't seen that.
Okay. Yeah. Can I? So I think one of the ways we're kind of talking past each other is that there are the why question can take on a number of different meanings. And so maybe to give a quick analogy, like the wall behind me is painted blue. And so you could ask, why is the wall painted blue? And there are a host of different ways you could answer that question. So one way is you could say, well, the light hits the wall, and all frequencies except the frequency corresponding to the color we see as blue are absorbed, and the other one is reflected, and we see that as blue. And this is one way of answering the question, why is the wall behind me blue? Another way to answer that question would be to say, well, my landlord painted it this way because he didn't like the color it was beforehand. And so those are two categorically different ways of answering the question, why. And I'm sure you probably have a lot better terms to give those questions than I've just given them. But that's where I think the evolutionary and the scientific explanation does a lot for answering, say, the first kind of why of how we got to that situation, of mechanically what leads up to the question. But asking why we on a purpose level of why we are in this unique situation of, and I'm probably using the word unique too much, of asking about our nature, of asking about the nature of the world around us, of asking about the nature of reality. From a naturalistic perspective, the answer to the sort of that second why, and I need better terms, and maybe you can help me come up with better terms, of more of a purpose perspective. The answer from a naturalistic perspective is there is no answer. There's no point. There's no meaning. There's no reason that we find ourselves in that unique situation, not from a mechanical explanation side of things, but from a purpose side of things. Whereas I think any sort of theistic perspective can give a purpose-related answer. And that's where we'll probably disagree. Anyways, I'll just leave it at that for now before I put words in your mouth.
So well, two things. Your example about you're talking about the mechanics of light, and then the landlord painting it. I actually think that, I understand the analogy we're trying to make, but I actually don't think that works, because you also know that the landlord painted it blue through an empirical approach. Like, we know that landlords exist. We know that houses exist. Painting is a thing. We know all those things through our actual experience in real time of things that we can actually point to and observe in reality. But I understand the point. But what I would say is that I actually don't disagree that there are certain questions. It depends on what you mean by purpose, because I think naturalism entirely explains what it is we mean by purpose, with what I said about fulfillment earlier. Sounds to me like you're talking about sort of a more cosmic, all-encompassing purpose, that the universe itself has a purpose, not just that we derive purpose from existing and thinking about our situation. But again, it's true that religion or theism comes up with a story that science doesn't come up with. But that's just the point. I agree with you there, but that's the problem, is that on what grounds do you show that the story that you've come up with has any connection to what's real, as opposed to just a story to try to make sense of patterns, because we're things that seek patterns. I reject those stories because I see no reason to believe in the assumption of a cosmic purpose in the first place. I'm okay with the individual purpose that I think is real. I don't think it's an illusion. I just think that it's different than what you're describing purpose to be. I'm okay with looking at reality and saying, sometimes I don't know. I don't have an answer. I don't think it's a weakness of science and a strength of religion that it claims to answer those questions. That's primarily my problem with religion, is that, and ideology in general, is that you're claiming to have knowledge that you have no methodology of actually grounding. So you're coming up with a question that may or may not make sense. You're saying, I have an answer that you have no way of showing is real as opposed to just imaginary. You're saying it makes more sense to you intuitively, even though we know that many of our intuitions actually fail, and we know this through a far more rigorous method. And so I can agree with what you just said, but it's actually why I'm an atheist, because I don't buy into the premises that religion buys into, and the narratives that it tells itself and claims that we need to make. That's
okay. As usual, that was a lot to take.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I feel like I'm talking too much, but
no, you're good. And I think I'm just starting to get people talk about Zoom fatigue. So I think like listening is getting harder and harder as we continue this conversation. But I think to sort of further unpack my landlord example, that's where there are two different kind of questions for why, of an explanation of how things came to be and how things work, which I think science explains very, very well. In terms of, I need terms for those questions, and I'm still kind of working with myself on how to give terms well. But as we talk about answering that question of why for the wall, of it's blue because of how it works, of how it produces the wavelength, versus it's blue because of intent. Science answers the first one well, and so as we extrapolate, I guess to term those questions of mechanics versus intent, can I use those terms just to try and refer to those? Science answers the mechanics of why we're here observing the world around us, and science does that in either a theistic perspective or an atheistic perspective. Either like a theist or an atheist can both agree. Science answers the mechanical why of simply what is happening to produce the situation we're in. And science does a great job of answering that. I think the answer science gives to the intent why of for what purpose we are here is to say there is no greater purpose, which is inherently unsatisfactory to me. And that's where we get back to the basics of human understanding and the very basics of what are the starting points of human experience. And the starting point, as I see it, is we have this unique position. And I'm probably adding a little bit more than I said originally, but we have this unique position that calls for the question, why from an intent perspective. Did that make sense?
Yeah, no, I'm not in disagreement. I just think that the whole assumption of intent is the problem. Mm-hmm. You have to prove your premises for them to be justified. Mm-hmm. And I can always push it back farther too. I can say, well, okay, so why is it that God has that intent? Like, there's still a why that you can't answer. Like, you can say, yeah, this is what he decided to do, but why did he decide to do that? Mm-hmm. That we don't know. Like, there's always more why that you can ask in any worldview. Mm-hmm. I would be happy to bring you back at some point if you're willing, and we can talk more about this. I appreciate your time in coming on. I know you said you're starting to get a little tired.
Yeah, just a little bit. As you've been saying things, I've been wanting to track all of it, and things are slipping through the cracks at this point.
Yeah, I should try. I'm trying to learn to be a little bit more concise.
So I need to work on that too.
No, you're doing fine. No, you're fine. I hope that I didn't, you didn't feel like I was over speaking you at all.
No, not at all. And honestly, I'm just excited to kind of, my notes are a mess, but I'm excited to skim through them and think on all the things we've talked about here. Because I see some of the points you're raising. And that's where I guess I shouldn't continue the conversation too much if we're wrapping up. So yeah.
Let's see. Do we have any questions from the audience? Here's one. Or more, I think it's more of a comment. Oh yeah.
Okay. It helps for me if I read it out loud, if that's cool. Why speaks to God's intention if he knows all? What's the point in setting up a process of evolution already knowing the outcome? Why not create things in their optimal form from the start? I'm not going to have a terrific answer to that, but honestly, I think that's starting to ask why questions of God becomes more complex, and that's not how I want to put that. Because at the end of the day, what we're simply looking at, I think what we've kind of boiled it down to is which has more merit, looking at things from a theistic perspective or a skeptic, agnostic, atheist, however you want to put it, perspective. And that's where I think I'm trying to point at our knowledge of purpose as a piece of evidence we can look at to say this demands an answer. But once we start asking those why questions of God, there's less of evidence to look at that demands an answer. And so with respect to that question of evolution and God's intent there, I feel like that goes beyond the scope of simply asking which makes more sense, theism or lack thereof.
So I would say that's special pleading. I would say that's really not, I think you're recognizing that asking why about the nature of God is unanswerable. The same way that I would say asking why about the nature of nature is unanswerable. Mm-hmm. It's not that we have evidence to talk about it in nature and not with God. No, it's the reason why my worldview has more merit is because it makes less assumptions, and the claims it makes them in conclusion to a process that is far more rigorous. Mm-hmm. And so if you want to say that cosmic meaning is a thing, or that God exists, or that these things have answers, I'm going to need a justification that goes beyond, well, it sounds good. Mm-hmm. Because the observations about uniqueness, meaning, these things, they can all be, my worldview has, I think, all the possible answers it can have. And where it fails to answer those questions, I don't think religion has an answer that can be shown to be real and not just imagined. Mm-hmm. That's the problem I have.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, and I think there's we could keep talking about this for hours too. I don't know if we want to filter through more questions or how to do this, because I'm sure I'm going to say something in answer to a question. You'll disagree with it. I'll disagree with what you said, and we could just start over again. So I don't know if we want to take more questions or how this goes from here.
So it's up to you. Does anybody have more questions? I don't know if anyone has anything left over. I think we pretty much are aware of where we stand, right? Like where differences are.
Yeah. And I guess I don't see it as special pleading. And I think what I'd say for that is I'm starting from the place of looking at myself and my own experience and seeing purpose as a cosmic purpose. I think is the term you gave it. And starting from that I at least perceive it in that way. The question is that perception accurate? And what from a why and an intent perspective answers that best. And so from that, I think it's not special pleading to then because all the question we're asking in terms of piecing together evidence for that is theism versus lack thereof. So to then start asking questions of God is to go beyond the question we're asking here and trying to look at evidence for here of theism versus lack thereof. I don't know if that was expressed correctly.
No, I think I understand where you're coming from. like I can understand the perspective. I think ultimately the question of why doesn't have to be confined by one particular question, right? Like, and I'm not saying I think it's special pleading in the sense that, you know, you are convinced the why has an answer in one context, but then are comfortable with not answering it in another.
Mm-hmm.
I would just say that.
So can I interject really quick there? That's where I could probably start trying to answer that why question of God, and I wouldn't say I'd have a perfect answer, but I don't think that has any pertinence to the question on the table of theism versus lack thereof.
No, that's fine.
I'm not going there.
That's fine. You know, why does it need a purpose? Kat asks.
Yeah, and so this becomes sort of a harder thing to point to, but it seems pretty apparent to me a core part of the human experience is a perception of purpose, that we think the things we do matter, and we think that the situation we find ourselves in of having a perception of reality and of asking about the nature of reality has a purpose. To me, that's a starting point. That's not a question, because I think that's something humans have experienced a perception of, and a search for purpose throughout recorded human history.
Sure, I don't deny that,
mm-hmm.
but I just think that aside from the fact that there are people who don't feel that purpose, who are actually sort of feel the exact opposite, but I don't deny that search has always been part of us, and I do believe purpose is a thing, as I said earlier. I guess the point that remains is that I think one, we define purpose a little bit differently. You want to extend it on a cosmic level. I don't. But also the fact that we have a sort of intuition doesn't necessarily suggest anything on its own. With something like that, I think purpose is just another way of describing experience. So we can say purpose exists because we have an experience of fulfillment. What we can't say and don't have the grounds to say currently is that because we have a sense of purpose, we can extrapolate from that feeling that the universe as a whole has a purpose, that God put a purpose there. Those are claims that I don't feel you've defended, or that theists in general, they just sort of state it as though it's the case, to which I would say, well, prove it. You know, and to just look at the purpose we feel, while I agree it's there, you can extrapolate from that to this far larger thing. You know, you're making more assumptions than I think you have the capacity of, or that you should be making.
Yeah, but I think that could be a really great continuation of this conversation, of saying, all right, we have this perception of purpose. I think it exists. You think it is, at least on any sort of cosmic level, purely illusory. Let's hash that out. I think that would be like a whole conversation in itself, and a good one at that. And I think I had ways to push back.
And by the way, I would also add one last thing, is that even if there was some cosmic purpose, how I can easily imagine that being a natural explanation rather than a supernatural one. So even if I was to grant you some kind of cosmic purpose that we're simply unaware of, maybe the one they have access to, who's to say that has to be God? You know, to what degree? Again, to me, as someone that does philosophy, my concern is I want to be as intellectually honest as I possibly can with the tools that I have, and so I want to try to eliminate as many assumptions as I can to try to get to the clearest and most reasonable conclusions about my condition, that and the reality that I'm a part of. And so I'm uncomfortable with making assumptions where they don't need to be made. and that's why I'm where I am. So,
but
like I said, I appreciate you coming on and sharing your perspective, and I would love to do this again.
Yeah,
I hope I didn't overtalk you too much.
No, not at all. Yeah, and I think especially once I've kind of unzoom fatigued a little bit, I'll have fun thinking over this, probably reviewing this video a bit and more accurately kind of absorbing the things we've said during it. So yeah, I think this has been really, really fascinating and helpful for me to think through why I believe what I believe.
I appreciate that, and I will definitely have you back. And to everyone watching, Mike is having some technical issues, as we always have, but I'm sure that he extends his well wishes to all of you, like I will, to all the other channels, both religious and not, that are doing what they can to continue this type of conversations in a honest and respectful manner. We appreciate you guys, and thanks for everyone that's tunes in and watches what we're doing. And we'll be coming out with more content, in the near future. And thanks everyone. I don't know what else to say.
Thanks for having me. This is new for me.
Usually Mike is the one that closes up the show, so I'm not so used to doing that.
Well, I think you did a great job.
So thank you, and thanks for coming on, and we'll keep in touch.
Yeah, sounds great.